Hello, good afternoon to all of you. I hope all of you are doing well. So in today's class, we're going to discuss about requirement engineering. Now, requirement engineering is an explicit phase in case of software engineering that is purely dedicated to requirement gathering, requirement analysis, and requirement specification. Now, why there is a need for an explicit requirement engineering phase is to ensure that the set of requirements that we have gathered are correct, complete, and consistent. Now, these three qualities will basically determine the success of the overall software system. That basically implies we need to dedicate sufficient amount of effort, time, and cost for engineering requirements because the success of the overall system depends on the success of the requirement engineering phase. So, requirement engineering has three subphases in it. These subphases are requirement gathering, requirement analysis, and requirement specification. Now, the objective of requirement gathering is to know what the system is all about and to know what the customer actually wants from the system. So, these are the two focus points of requirement gathering phase, to know what the system is all about and to know what the system is supposed to do. Now, in order to execute the requirement gathering phase, there might be different types of tools that may be used. The tools includes interviews, questionnaires, use cases, prototyping, right? Focus group session, and many more. So there are different types of rules that may be used for gathering requirement from the customer. Now, once the requirements are gathered, we need to analyze the requirement. So whenever we analyze the requirement, we tend to eradicate the problems that may be associated with the set of requirements. Now, once the problems associated with the set of requirements are resolved or weeded out, what we need to do is we need to create a specification of the requirements. Now, we need to create a specification in a manner that the specification is understandable to a wide set of audiences. Now, there are different types of audiences for requirement specification document. The audiences includes test engineers, maintenance engineers, client, developers, marketing agent, document writers. So the requirements that are specified has to be understandable to all the set of audiences. So in order to promote that or in order to ensure that the understandability is enhanced, we need to rather focus on what then how. So we need to specify what the system actually does rather than how the system actually does it, right? So these are the objectives of three phases that are there in software lifecycle, system the requirement engineering in case of software lifecycle. Right. So the sub phases are requirement gathering, requirement analysis, and requirement specification. Now let us try to focus on requirement analysis process. Now requirement analysis is a tedious and a time-consuming process that tries to eradicate the problems that may be associated with the set of requirements pertaining to the system. Now the problems may be anomalies, ambiguities, and omissions. Anomalies basically refers to abnormally specified definitions. So, for an example, if I say that you need to turn on the heater when the temperature is low, is a anomalous definition because there might be different ways in which the interpretation of this particular statement may be done. So, in order to prevent such kind of situation, you need to specify it in a manner that you need to turn on the heater when the temperature is less than 10 degrees Celsius. So, this is the way how what you can do is you can eradicate anomalies. Now, contradictions basically refers to existence of multiple definition of same aspect of interest. So, an example, if one of the end users says that you need to turn on the heater when the temperature is less than 10 degrees Celsius, and the other end user may say that you need to turn on the heater when the temperature is less than 12 degrees Celsius. So, there exists multiple definition of same problem, same aspect of interest. So, here what we need to do is we need to sit down with the customer or the end users and we need to resolve such kind of conflicts. And incompleteness basically refers to a situation where you have not identified all the requirements that are to be implemented for a particular system. So as a system analyst, it's this responsibility of yours to identify the potential requirements and let the customer know that these are the set of potential requirements that the system may have, from which a customer may have an idea about what are the actual set of requirements they want from the software system. So requirement analysis is a very tedious and a time consuming process. Now definitely requirement analysis in requirement engineering phase mandates delicate psychological skills, because you need to constantly interact with the customer and constantly take their feedback at different point in time when the customer may be in different orientations or different state of mind. So you need to have a very good psychological skill in order to extract the requirement from the customer and analyze it. Now, definitely, whenever new systems are built, new system changes the way how the environment and the people interact with and the system interact with each other, right? So, in order to ensure that there is a seamless and a smooth transition between the existing system and the new system, we need to ensure that all the stakeholders are identified, they are interviewed, and their confidence is taken into account, and only then the system is implemented. So, in such situation, the overall success of the new product will be very high. Right, so it is very important for one to identify all the stakeholders and take into account their confidence whenever you are trying to implement a new system, because it is their acceptance of the software system that will determine the success of the software system. Now, analysts may employ several techniques for electing requirement from the customer. As we have discussed, there might be different ways in which requirements may be collected from the customer. So it may be interviews, or it may be focus group sessions, it may be prototyping, or it may be use cases, or it may be a questionnaire. So there are different ways of creating a requirement list that contains the set of requirements pertaining to the system from the customer. So here we have identified some of the modern techniques that's called as prototyping and use cases. Now, it may so happen that in situations you may have to adapt combinations of all of these techniques in order to ensure that all the set of requirements are gathered from the customer. So a kind of hybrid approach may be adapted to in order to gather requirement from the customer that tries to inculcate in it attributes of all the mechanisms that we have discussed it now. Now, requirement analysis basically has three subphases in it. These are electing requirement, analyzing requirement, and recording requirement. Now, electing requirement is a mechanism of communicating with the customer with an objective of gathering what the requirements are from the customer. So the task of communicating with the customers and users to determine what their requirements are called as requirement elicitation. Now this is also called as requirement gathering. This is what we've learned till now. Now analyzing requirement, it's task of resolving problems that may be associated with set of requirements. As we have already said that requirements may be anomalous in nature, it may be ambiguous in nature, it may be incomplete in nature. So, in order to resolve all these problems, what we need to do is we need to analyze the requirement. Then, requirement recording is a mechanism of specifying the requirement or preparing a document of the requirements that we have identified so that it can be used by varied set of audiences for their purpose specific task. Now, requirement engineering. So, this we have discussed in the previous slide, but we'll go through it again. So, systematic requirement analysis, also known as requirement engineering, it's also sometimes loosely referred to by the name requirement gathering, requirement capture, and requirement specification. So, this is what we've learned in the previous slide. So requirement engineering basically includes three different phases that are requirement gathering or requirement elicitation, requirements analysis, and requirement specification. So now requirement engineering can be divided into six sub phases, namely requirement elicitation, requirement analysis and negotiation, requirement specification, system modeling, requirement validation, and requirement management. Again, I'll repeat it. Requirement engineering can be broadly classified into six subphases. These subphases are requirement elicitation or requirement gathering, requirement analysis and negotiation, requirement specification, requirement system modeling, requirement validation, and eventually requirement management. Now, the aim of requirement elicitation is to identify all potential set of requirements from the customer. The requirement analysis phase is a phase that is dedicated to eradicating the problems that may be associated with the set of requirements. And negotiation basically means coming to a common understanding about the set of requirements that are to be implemented. And then what we have is we have requirement specification, where what we try to do is we try to specify the requirement in some desired format that can be further used by a wide set of audiences. And what we have next is we have system modeling phase. System modeling phase is a phase that is dedicated for creating a representation of system that can be implemented using any of the or that can be used in order to create or extract design for a particular system. Then eventually the requirement are to be validated, because we need to ensure that the set of requirements are correct. And then eventually we need to manage the requirements, so any changes that are called for in a set of requirement has to be managed. So these are the six subphases that requirement engineering has, and the specific rules of the six subphases. Now, there are multiple definitions of requirement engineering. So, requirement engineering, according to LaPlante, is a subdiscipline of system engineering and software engineering that is concerned with determining the goals, functions, and constraints of the hardware and the software system. So, this is very much important definition. So, LaPlante has defined as requirement engineering as a subphase of system engineering and software engineering that is concerned with determining the goals, functions, and constraints of hardware and software system. Now, in some of the software lifecycle model, you see, in some of the software lifecycle model, it may so happen that we may start up with requirement analysis phase, right, instead of feasibility study, because in situation where we have a concrete knowledge about what is the system that is to be developed, right, again, and what are the functionalities that are to be implemented, then what we can do is we can straight away start with the requirement analysis phase. Or what does it implies that in situation where there is a physical system or physical mimic of the system that is to be implemented, or a logical mimic of the system that is to be implemented, then what we can do is we can ensure that we can directly start with the analysis phase instead of feasibility study phase. Now, let us again focus on requirement analysis. So, requirement analysis is the process of understanding what the customer actually needs and what is the expectation from the proposed system or the application. And it's a well-defined phase in case of software development lifecycle model. So this is what we have learned in the previous slide as well. So requirement analysis process is a process that is purely dedicated for understanding the customer's needs and expectation and resolving the problems that are associated with it. And it's a prominent phase in case of software development lifecycle model. Now, requirements are description of how the system should exhibit behavior, because eventually system is expected to exhibit behavior, and requirements are description of those behaviors. Okay, so system is expected to exhibit behaviors, exhibit behavior, that basically means it's expected to take in input value and generate certain desired output value. So requirements are basically a description of that. So it is an alternate, it can be alternately stated that what an application is expected to do. Now, now just see, one of the important aspect is that there might be different ways in which interaction may be possible between the user and the business process, right? So it is very much important for us to ensure that the system is capable of supporting the simplest of the request and most complex of the requirements as well. Okay, because say for an example, a sophisticated user may want a complex set of requirements to be implemented, whereas a starter or amateur may want a very simple set of requirements to be implemented for realizing a business process. So in order to ensure that the set of audiences or the users who will be actually using the system is capable of performing operation using the software system. So what we need to do is we need to be able to build up a system that supports multi-skill label or multiple labels of user. So this is a very important statement that we need to understand, right? Because there might be requirement for complex set of requirements, or there might be a requirement for a simple set of requirements. So a system should be capable of satisfying all possible needs of the customer. Now, As we have already learned, software requirement analysis process covers the complex task of electing and documenting all the requirements of the user, modeling and analyzing the requirements, and documenting them as the basis for system design. Now, just see the subsequent phase after requirement analysis and specification phase is called as system design phase. So, what we need to do is we need to build up sufficient amount of information pertaining to system in terms of requirements and non-functional requirements in order to enable the designers to design the system in an appropriate manner. Now, in order to ensure that we execute the requirement analysis phase and requirement analysis phase in a very effective manner, what we need to do is we need to have a very skilled requirement analyst, right? Okay, so a dedicated and a specialized requirement analyst is best equipped to handle the job. The requirement analysis function may also fall under the scope of project manager or business analyst, depending upon the organizational hierarchy. So there are specific roles that people play in different organizations. Okay, so system analysts or project managers are the roles that are responsible for executing the task of requirement analysis. So you see, software requirement analysis and documentation process are critical to the software project success. So this is what we have learned in the previous slide, that the overall success of the software product basically depends on the success of the requirement engineering phase. So now, why is requirement analysis necessary? So as we have learned in the previous slide as well, so again we'll repeat it. So studies reveal that inadequate attention to software requirement analysis at the beginning of the project is the most common cause for a critically vulnerable project that often do not deliver even on the basis of tasks for which they are being designed. So it may so happen that in situation where the requirement analysis phase is not properly executed, then the system that is being built may not be able to cater to the requirement for which it's built for. Okay, so it may so happen that eventually the customer may not be willing to accept the software system because the software system is not capable of satisfying the requirement of the customer. So that's the reason why requirement analysis is very much necessary, right? Or it's a very important phase in case of software life cycle. Now there are instances of corporations that have spent huge amount of capital on software project where the end application eventually does not perform the task for what it's intended for. So if the analysis process has not been executed properly, no matter how much investment you do in case of development or in case of aesthetics of the software system may not be capable of delivering what it's intended to do. Right? So, an example: if you have implemented a false set of requirements, and even if the system looks very good, the system may not be capable of performing what's expected by the software system. So, software companies are now investing huge amount of time and resources in effective and streamlined software requirement analysis process as a prerequisite to successful projects. So that's what we have learned. We have been focusing on the overall success of the software system depends on the success of requirement engineering phase. So that's why companies are investing huge amount of capital in order to ensure that the requirement engineering is successfully executed, because the entire success of the development, the testing, the deployment, the acceptance, the maintenance depends on the success of the requirement analysis phase. Now, what are the steps in requirement analysis process? So let us further elaborate it, right? First important thing is fix system boundaries, identify the customers, requirement elicitation, right? Okay, so we'll elaborate on each of these phases, right? So the steps that are included in requirement analysis are fixing system boundary, identifying the customer, and then what we have is we have requirement elicitation phase, right? Okay, and then we have requirement analysis process, okay, requirement specification process, and so on and so forth. So we'll be discussing each of this in detail. Do not worry about that, right? So let us focus on the first phase of requirement analysis, so fixing system boundaries. So why do we need to fix up system boundary? Is very much important, because this, until unless we do not fix the system boundary or the scope of the system, it may be very difficult for us to analyze the software system, right? Okay, so fixing a system boundary helps in identifying how the new application integrates with the business process and how it fits into larger picture and what is the scope and the limitations there will be for the new system, right? So this is very much important because until unless you do not fix up the system boundary, you may not be able to determine what is the scope of the system, how the business system business process fits into the new system, right? Again, what will be their limitations. So this is very much important. So this is a very important task in case of system requirement analysis process, to know what is the limit of the system, because only if you know the limit of the system, then you will be capable of determining the way how it integrates the activities it performs, and the set of limitations it has. Now once you identify the scope, the limitations and the way how it integrates, and what we need to do is we need to identify the customer and the needs of the customer. So first and foremost, what I need to do is I need to ensure that the set of the customers for the software systems are actually identified. Right? Again, now customers are basically referred to as stakeholders, or it refers to the group of people who will be directly or indirectly impacting the new application. Because you see, eventually it is the customer who will be buying or who will be making use of that particular system, and it's the customer who will be actually investing for the system. So it's very important for one to identify the customers for that particular system, and the needs of the customer, and the way how the system, the way how the customer makes the wants the system to look like. Okay. So this is the second important activity that you perform. So the first one is to fix the system boundary. The second one is to identify the customer. The objective of fixing the system boundary is to know what is the scope of the system, as to know what are the limitations of the system, and to know how the system is going to integrate in the larger picture or interact with the other business processes. And second phase is to identify the customers. Only if you identify the customers, you will be able to identify what are the requirements of the customer, right? Again, and how they are going to use that particular software system, right? And how what are the expectation of the expectation of the customers from the software system. So that is what you're going to identify in the second phase. So here again, what we have specified is that we have specified that requirement elicitation is a very important phase in case of requirement analysis, right? Okay. So requirement elicitation, so information is gathered from multiple stakeholders identified, right? Again, the requirement analysis draws out from each of these groups of groups of audiences what are the requirements of the application, and what are their expectations from the application. The level of details of the requirements list is based on the number and the size of the user, the degree of the complexity of business process, and the size of the application. Right? Again, so this is also very true. So whenever you're trying to elect requirements, so what you need to do is you need to gather requirement from multiple stakeholders. Right? Okay? You need to gather requirement from different stakeholders. Right? Okay? And then what we need to do is we need to identify what are the expectations of the customers, or expectation of the stakeholder from the application, or what the application is expected to do, and the level of detailedness of the requirement list, because different stakeholders may be capable of expressing same requirement in different degrees of detailedness. So what we also need to do is also need to extract all possible details about the requirement at varied levels of understanding from different set of audiences. Okay. Now, just see this is an important aspect: the degree of complexity of business process and the size of the application. Because depending upon the way how we interact with the stakeholders, and depending upon the level of intellect of the stakeholders, we will be able to determine the complexity that is involved in the business process and the size of the software application. So this is very much important. So requirement elicitation is very much important phase, because it's the requirement elicitation phase that enables one to extract all possible requirements pertaining to the system from the customer. Now, problems that may be related to requirement elicitation. as we have already learned about, ambiguous understanding of the process, inconsistency within a single process by multiple users, insufficient input from the stakeholders, conflicting stakeholders' interest, change in requirement after a project has begun. So these may be the set of problems that may be associated with the requirements that are gathered or elected, right? Again, that is ambiguous understanding of the process, right? Inconsistency within a single process by multiple user, insufficient input from stakeholders, conflicting stakeholders' interest, and change in the requirement after the project has begun. So, in order to overcome the set of problems that we have identified, a requirement analyst has to interact closely with multiple work groups, often with conflicting goals, to arrive at a bona fide requirement list, right? Or a very concrete requirement list pertaining to the system. So strong communication and people skills along with sound programming knowledge are prerequisite for an expert requirement analyst. So this is a very important requirement for an expert or a requirement analyst, that they have a very good communication skill and communication and interpersonal skills, right? Again, with a very sound programming knowledge in order to resolve the conflicts that may be associated. Now, tools used for a requirement elicitation. So, traditional methods for requirement elicitation includes interviews and focus group sessions, right? Other methods involves building a flowchart for business process and the use of existing documents like user manuals, organizing charts, process models and system process specification, on-site analysis, interviews with end users, market research, and competitor analysis. So these are various tools. Just see that can be potentially used in order to elect requirement, where what we have is we have a complex and multi-layered requirement elicitation process as well, where what we do is we use computational tools like use cases and prototyping for requirement elicitation. So there are various types of tools that can be potentially used in order to elect requirement from the customer, which includes interviews, focus group sessions, flow charting, prototyping, use cases, right? Okay, process models for existing system, on-site analysis. So you see, these are various tools that are used. So you need to have an idea about the set of tools that are used. So some of the current requirement elicitation tools that are used are prototyping, as we discussed, use cases, data flow diagram, transitional process diagram, user interfaces, interviews, focus group sessions. So there are many elicitation tools. So in today's class, what we have learned about is we have learned about what is requirement analysis. We have learned about requirement engineering at first. We have learned about what is the importance of requirement engineering. We have learned about the sub phases in requirement engineering. We have learned about requirement gathering, requirement analysis, and requirement specification. Then we have learned about requirement analysis process. Okay, we have learned about what are the various types of activities that are performed during requirement analysis. We have learned about requirement elicitation, requirement analysis, and requirement recording. Then we moved on to requirement engineering in detail, where we have learned about what is requirement engineering, what are the phases of requirement engineering. So we've seen that there are 6 sub-phases in requirement engineering, which includes requirement elicitation, requirement analysis and negotiation, requirement specification, system modeling, requirement validation, and requirement management. And then we learned about some one of the standard definitions of requirement engineering as per LeBlanc, right, where he has defined requirement engineering as a subdiscipline of software engineering and system engineering that is concerned with determining the goals, functions, and the constraints of the hardware and the software system. And then we have learned about in situations where we can start with requirement analysis phase instead of feasibility study phase. And we have learned about further. We have learned about requirement analysis in detail, right? And then we have learned about the very need for requirement analysis, and we have learned about various steps that are involved in requirement analysis phase, where we have learned about fixing system boundary, identifying the customer, and then requirement elicitation. We will learn about the problems that are associated with requirement elicitation, and then we've learned about the tools that can be potentially used for requirement elicitation, the traditional tools and the modern tools, and we've in brief discuss about some of the tools that are currently used for requirement elicitation. So thank you very much. Have a very good day.